Welcome back to our second conversation on the topic of vocation. And I'm welcomed again by Chad and James and Julia and Jackie. Thank you all for being with us today.
Thanks.
And last week, just by way of, not last week, last time that we were able to record one of these, it was just a very generic conversation about vocation and attempting to define this word vocation specifically as we navigated some tough times here during this COVID-19 pandemic. And by way of review, just in most generic terms, we talked about vocation specifically being these roles that we have, roles that have been given to us by our Creator God, and roles that we live out in our lives in relationship to others. So as spouse, as parent, as child, as worker, all of these things are included in this understanding of vocation. And specifically these being roles that God has given us and allows us to use to share His love and His gospel with those around us. After our last episode, a friend of mine reached out and said, thank you so much for the conversation. I was reading a book and on this similar topic, and she shared a quote with me that I think is really great as we get going today in our conversation. It's from Chad Bird in a book called Upside Down Spirituality. And he reminds us, he defines vocation there loosely as not how we make a living, but how life has made us. And so vocation, while we live it out in an active way, is very much passively received often from God, with the encouragement and the command and the exhortation to love and serve those that we're in relationship with. In addition to that, something we're going to tease out a little bit more this time. We mentioned how Luther in the 1500s took kind of the current understanding, the scholastic model or the medieval understanding of vocation as a very, very real hierarchy with those in the monastic orders and the priesthood on top, and teased it out to more of a personal way through a number of realms or estates that we're going to hope to dive into later on in our conversation. And as we now, as we're sitting here today, we are in the midst of phase one re-entry from COVID-19 shutdown, really, in the first part of the year. And I think this is a really good topic, very timely for us, as we are slowly beginning the process of re-entry and reestablishing routines and normalcy in some way, for us to pause and consider what are our vocations currently and how are those tied with our identity, and moving forward, how can those two work together for the good of the gospel and for our neighbor. So with that being said, I think we can dive right in. And Chad, I'm going to turn this over to you right now. I mentioned this idea of identity. I mentioned vocation as we talked about last week. And would you be so kind as to lead us off with maybe a few points about how these two are connected, and also how they're different, and how that's important for us to maintain both a connection and a difference between those terms?
Sure, thanks. So I think a couple of things are interesting about vocation. All of us have more than one at any given time. We've got multiple vocations, and they play out across the four realms that we'll talk about more in a few minutes: our role in the family, in church, as members of the state, or as citizens, and through our particular work, the way that we make a livelihood. And at the same time, it's important to remember that some of these vocations started at the very beginning of our lives, and they're never going to end. So in the family, for example, I'm always going to be a son, right? I'll always be a child of my parents. But some started later, and once they get started, those will never end. So I'm always going to be a dad now to Annabelle and Daphne. However, there are some of these other ones that don't last forever. And one of the ones that I think I'd like to just connect to this issue of identity, and one of the ways that it's sometimes troublesome in thinking about how I maybe imagine myself or tell myself the story about myself, When I was teaching at Concordia Portland, I did that for about 7 years from 2012 to 2019. And I had a lot of really fantastic student athletes come through my classes there. And one of the young ladies I remember was sitting in a junior year class with me, and she had just recently experienced an injury on the court and was pretty much disallowed to play for the rest of the year. And even more, none of the doctors or surgeons that she saw knew exactly what the right approach was to get her better. So at risk was also her senior year. And for her, basketball had been everything that she had ever done. She imagined herself primarily as a basketball player. Of course, she had these other vocations, and we were talking about them in my class. She was a student at Concordia. She was a child, right? A daughter. She was a friend, a neighbor, and many other things. But she imagined herself so much with this concentration on being a basketball player. And it really threw her. She lost a sense of herself with this role of playing basketball going away in a way that was out of her control. I saw the same sort of thing happen with a lot of my student athletes as they approached graduation, because pretty much that time for them is the end of their athletic career in any ongoing way other than kind of doing it as a hobby, say like as James does when he's out there running. None of my students were going to go on to any more professional service. Maybe they'd go on to being a coach or working in a school system and teaching younger students. But it was always a little bit of an identity crisis, because this is a way that they had known themselves and understood themselves for so long. Letting it go was a big deal. And so I want to just say that there are two really great things about vocation. It does give us a sense of identity, right? I know who I am. God has called me to be a son, a husband, a father, a church worker, and many of the other things that I do. But when we overemphasize one versus all of these other multiple vocations, it can sometimes get us into trouble. And so I'm going to throw it back to you, Andrew, and you've got a couple of questions that you wanted to take everybody else through in light of talking about this.
Yeah, I appreciate your example of the identity crisis of your student coming face to face with her vocations. And so as we maybe consider in our own lives, whether you're watching at home and perhaps you just got taken back in time to an identity of crisis of sorts. For those of us here on the panel today, whether you're thinking of a specific time in your life when this happened, or just the potentiality of this, what are the dangers, the potential dangers when we begin to mix too closely our vocations and our callings from God with our personal identities and how we identify ourselves? I don't know if anyone's got just a brief story or incident of that, or just any comments about that.
I can speak to that a little bit. I think Chad really hit the nail on the head. I think when you mix the idea of vocation with identity, or your identity becomes too wrapped up in maybe one vocation, then when that changes or when that goes away, I think there's always going to be some level of existential crisis, I think, when identities change or when those roles change. But I think when you make your identity just one vocation, then I think that heightens it to a whole nother level. And you see it a lot of, everybody experiences these different times. And so that's why when you talk with parents who are sending kids off to college and all of a sudden become empty nesters, there's a reason why I think almost across the board every parent struggles with that on some level. It's because they've spent the last 18 plus years taking care of their children, and they don't stop being parents, but it does change dramatically what being a parent means now that my son or daughter is going off to college and they're making their way on their own. And you see it with retirement. There's a whole bunch of different ways that plays out when you mix your idea of your vocation with identity.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, as far as the children going off to college and people losing
that identity. I've seen it manifest itself in the fact that the parents so much immerse themselves in being a parent and forgot about the wife or husband role, that
Oh yeah.
that adds to the crisis, because they don't know how to be married anymore without the kids around, without a ball game to go to, or something with their children. So I've seen that time and time again. It's very sad that they've let the one identity push the other one out the door.
Yeah, and I can add to that too, that, I think that's having 3 children in 3 different age groups. It's very hard around here to have just a general conversation without any kind of interruptions. And so, I have an 8th grader going through kind of an identity crisis right now, transitioning from 8th grade to starting high school. And, she feels that she's kind of ending her childhood, which, we remember those times. We think we're all grown up, and I'm trying to foster and counsel her through that. But then I have other little people interrupting and needing attention, and then making sure that, I also attend to my husband. And so yeah, that when one day they'll leave the nest, that my identity wasn't wrapped up in just being a mom, or just being a wife, or just being a speech therapist, or, whatever vocation. There's that balance that we need to find somehow. It's tricky.
Yeah, and I think it's important that we can understand, at least in some way, that our vocations, our callings from God, are helping to shape the identities that we have, the identity that we have here. That we are first and foremost a child of God, and because we're a child of God, God has placed us in this world and given us these vocations and ways to serve, and oftentimes, in a good way, these fulfill our identity, and these create our identity. And so oftentimes we're, when there's an identity crisis, a job is lost, a child moves away, or, if the Lord forbid, you lose a child, or you get a divorce, or these things happen, it's good to look back to our vocations and say, well, how is God calling me? What has God called me to do? And allowing those to fill us and point us towards maybe a new path, something else, or to help fill our the hole in our heart that losing a piece of our identity causes. And so as you all have been talking, I've been thinking about this, and I'm curious to know, as we often do as people, we like to create hierarchies. And I think that especially in matters of vocation, there's often kind of a real, or at least a perceived, hierarchy of this calling is better than this calling, and it's more important to do this than to do that. And how might your perception of those hierarchies, how might that impact your ability, positively or negatively, to fulfill your various vocations in a time of identity crisis? Anybody wants to jump on that one?
I'll start it off. I think just in general, with the closure of everything, everybody's jobs, has really changed, and it's certainly, I think, pushed people, or I'd like to say it's pushed people into reevaluating that idea of assigning value to people's jobs, and having them realize that this world works the way it works because we have these things in place for each person to fulfill. And if there's a piece missing there, then there is something that's going to come of that, and not necessarily a positive thing. So every job really needs to be valued, and it's such a good opportunity for us to teach, especially the young kids right now, and people going into jobs and careers, that every job has a purpose. So that's just my 2 cents there to kick it off.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. This pandemic has taught us that the minimum wage worker, the truck driver, the grocery clerk, they are very, very important to our society. And for too long, they've just been looked down upon as somebody that's there to take care of us, but we don't really value what they're doing for us.
Mhm.
Yeah, the one thing I could add is just that in the midst of this, for me, seeing how vocations, the vocations that I have anyways, those lines have blurred. So, before everything shut down, it was pretty clear cut. My vocation in the realm of my job, that happened, with some minor exceptions when I was at work. So 8 o'clock in the morning until I would leave in the afternoon, then I'd go back for a meeting or something. Like, there were pretty clear distinctions. Whereas now, I've been home with my kids for 2.5 months, and I played teacher, I played parent, played pastor, all of these things mixed together. And some, like you, I think we were talking earlier, Julia, you talk about how, you're trying to get work done, but then when your little one, so for me, Gabby, who's 5, comes and says, Daddy, can you help me with a coloring page? Or something else. I can't just say, no, come talk to me in 3 hours. There's a blurring of those distinctions. And if you were to make a clear cut line and say, right now for the next hour or 2 hours, this is what I'm doing and I'm not doing anything else, then I would be, I wouldn't be doing, I think, what God would want me to do there in that moment.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting for me to have been watching the world go by in the last couple months, and to see that things that were once considered unglamorous and not important have really been highlighted as essential and important. And while at the same time, talking to people whose jobs were important, and those jobs don't exist anymore, because changes in the world have said, right now, this is not essential, or this is not important. And there's been a real upset, for good and for ill, in this moment. But the reality stands in all of that while there may be some things that in the world are more important now or not, that, in my opinion, if it's a calling from God, it's important to God. And that all the things that we're doing, big and small, whether you're a frontline healthcare worker, or a teacher who's trying to teach on Zoom, or someone who barely made the cut at work, or someone who got laid off, God is still calling you through various ways, and various vocations to serve him. And I've got one quote before we get to kind of our last section here. Again, from Chad Bird. This is from a different text. Your God is too glorious. I was reading through this recently, and it hit way too close to home. On this idea that he writes that God hides in plain sight. He hides in places that look nothing like God's hangouts. He has sunk himself into our unglamorous lives, that there God might do what he does best: give, love, serve, help, and pray. The little things we do, pouring cereal for our sleepy children in the morning, driving a delivery truck to keep businesses rolling, visiting a friend who's laid up in the hospital, these seemingly little things are divine deeds over which angels rejoice. And that's their hidden beauty, that they're unnoticed by earth and applauded by heaven. And these unglamorous deeds that God does through us, he does in many and various ways. And so, Chad, we'll take it back to you. If you were able to briefly explain to us, again, these realms, these places where God calls us to fulfill these vocations, and then the rest of us here on the panel, we can share a little bit about how God is calling us personally to serve and live out our vocations in those various realms.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so Luther, he's well known for being brilliant, but much of his brilliance just comes out in helping us have a great practical understanding of the way that God is at work in the world. And that's what I love about his doctrine of vocation. It's probably one of the easiest Christian doctrines to understand. So whether you think you're really well versed in the Bible and Christian theology, or you're totally a newbie, this is something you can pick up on, and he helps you understand the story of of your connection to God's work in the world, and you can kind of walk away seeing all the things that you do in your life practically through the lens of vocation without having a lot of other prior knowledge. And so one of the ways that he helps us do this is he just throws out 4 categories. Old-fashioned, he calls them estates. I usually like to use the word realms or spheres. It's just slightly more familiar. But he gives us 4 of them, and he says these are the 4 primary areas where we live out our lives and where we can kind of categorize our vocational roles. And the first one is the family. The second one is in the church. The third is in the state or as a citizen. And the fourth is in our work. Luther might want to add a 5th one that we could play around with. There's a bit of flexibility when we talk about serving our neighbor, because not everything fits cleanly into these 4 categories that he's given us, but we'll focus on these 4. So I'm just going to toss it out to all of you and just give me a brief 30 seconds on some of your vocational roles in the family. Who are you in the family?
Yeah, for me, I'm a dad, I'm a son, a brother, an uncle, and those are for me, the primary ways that plays out in family for me.
Ditto.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, those are literally the 4 primary ones that I have as well, which is fun.
Daughter, wife, mother, organizer. I keep it all together.
And I would second that.
All right, so that's pretty easy. We could always go extended roles. When you think about family, we don't want to exclude anybody who might be, you know, like a stepson or a stepdaughter or somebody's second spouse. These things happen, as Andrew recognized, right? All of these roles matter. We've got grandparents, we've got grandchildren, we've got cousins and aunties and uncles, and we can be very expansive talking about the roles that we have, the relationships within the family structure. Sometimes they're very close, sometimes they're distant. Some of them start at the beginning of life. So we'll never not be children, but some of them start later. Being a spouse, being a parent, being a grandparent sometimes starts even later. But once they get going, they never end. They are gifts to us from God in that way. We'll talk about the second one, church. In the way Luther structured it, it's really only got 2 primary vocations. Either you're professionally trained person that's serving in the church, such as a DCE like Andrew, or in Luther's medieval times you had nuns and sisters, or we've got pastors, priests, cardinals, and a variety of other vocations within the Lutheran Church, like director of church music or something like that. So you've got those roles, and to go back to Andrew's point a minute ago, the hierarchy, there really is no hierarchy. These are just set aside and specified because of specific kind of training that you have. But then the other primary role is someone who's a layperson. And I think the variety is much wider and deeper there. And really a layperson is someone who serves in the church in some capacity. And so I think I'm just going to leave it open to all of you to fill in, like, what's your role in this regard? Are you a church professional? If so, what role do you play? If you're a lay person, what role do you play in that regard?
Great. James, I'm going to defer to you and let you tell us what your role is.
Yeah, so I'm a pastor, and that kind of like being a lay person, that plays out in a lot of different ways at different times, but, you know, lead services and do all the rest.
Yeah, and so intentionally I pass that off to you because I see one of my main vocations. I am called as a director of Christian education, but my calling in the church is to serve under the umbrella of the pastoral office, and in Lutheran circles we call it an auxiliary office, where I'm commissioned into the ministry, but serving the pastoral ministry with a pastor or pastors in our case who are overseeing and directing the ministry of the church. And so I have my primary vocation is teaching in the church and administrating programs for children and youth. And all of that should be centered for me as under my vocation as a teammate. And I think that's a really important piece for me as I consider working in the church, that I am part of a team, both with pastoral staff, but also teaming with our church members who we are lifting up and raising up into various vocations. So Jackie, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you fulfill your vocation in the church?
Well, I think that hat that I wear on the family side as organizer also fits at church. I tend to step up into some of those organizing roles, getting programs going and projects going. I think I've discovered through this pandemic that baking, cooking is my love language. And so if somebody says somebody needs a meal or a pick me up, then I'm all for doing things like that too, just to make people feel loved. So I'm just kind of the worker bee, whatever anybody needs. I think they've got me on speed dial.
I'm a great example of somebody who wasn't raised in the church and would not feel like the first one to want to volunteer to assist in any way, because I wasn't raised specifically in a practicing Christian household, and it wasn't until my late teens that I on my own began to make my way to Christ. And that's been a long journey for me. So my talent specifically lies with educating young students, and especially those with differences in learning style and behavioral needs and speech and language. And so, I've been able to support the preschool staff in the Sunday school program, which has been really fun for me because usually at school, I'm the one calling the shots, and this is just something I just take a back seat, and the ladies run the show, and they look for me for, support on helping the young students learn and behavioral needs or any of the language changes or any of that. So it's been fun because I'm learning many of the stories that you've heard a million times, and I really haven't, because I started later in life. So it's been really fun because like I said, I'm not your traditional person that would volunteer to help, but God has found a purpose for me in the church.
Yeah, great. And Chad, I would be remiss if we didn't come back to you on this question, because you find yourself, as we talked about these two areas of ministers and lay people being clearly kind of laid out, you find yourself right in the middle of those. And so how would you self-define how you fulfill your vocation, both as a trained pastor and a church member without a call to a specific parish?
Yeah, so my call, the two that I've had, even though I'm an ordained minister, has never been directly to a church. My first one was to serve on the faculty of religion at Concordia Portland, which I did for 7 years. And now I'm serving in my second call, which is to Lutheran Hour Ministries. And I serve as regional director for North America. And part of my role there is really just helping Lutheran Hour. We're a lay organization. We're focused on equipping lay people to share and nurture their faith. And so I oversee a variety of ministries that are doing that, and trying to adventurously imagine some more possibilities for things that we can do. It's a fairly new role at Lutheran Hour. So I've got a lot of flexibility. But I love it, and thinking about our culture and our world and the people that we have the chance to serve is always very exciting to me. And like Julia, part of what motivates me is that I came into the church from atheism when I was a freshman in college. And so I'm always kind of thinking with that in the back of my mind, that experience of what was it like being an outsider, and how might that shape the way that we engage with people who are not a part of who we are, and how can we introduce them to this Jesus that we know, who loves us and wants to love them in all the same ways that we get to experience on a regular basis. So thanks for throwing that back to me, Andrew. Just going back to the layperson role, I mean, I've served as a layperson for a long time. That's how I came into the church. I was on secretarial staff. I did groundskeeping and janitorial work in the church when I was a college student. I was also a church musician. And when I went to seminary, I kind of kept that up and helped start a new ministry through music. So just starting to think about all the variety of roles within the church that lay people do. You know, we've got office administrators at the congregation. We've got people who take care of the grounds and plow the snow. And we've got people who decorate during major holidays and you know, hand out the bulletins on Sunday morning and serve as elder board members and on the altar guild and so on and so forth. So I hope I'm naming a few that our listeners or our viewers are thinking about for their own selves as they pay attention here. Let's quickly go on to the second one. So Luther talks about, or excuse me, the third, Luther talks about the state. And that's just the place where we all have citizenship. And there's a variety of possible roles that we could have as citizens. And since I prepped this group ahead of time, I'm just going to try to do a round robin. We'll start with Andrew. Tell me 2 roles that you have as a citizen.
Yeah, I am a property owner and therefore pay taxes. And I also am a voting member of society. So hopefully able to exercise that here in the next week or so.
Okay, and we'll jump over to Julia. 2 more roles that you have as a citizen.
I can't, I can't really think of anything outside of what Andrew was saying. So yeah, same.
You obey the law.
Sorry.
Do you obey
I
the law?
obey the
You obey
law.
the law.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I am not driving with my cell phone. We just had that discussion too.
Yeah.
So I obey those traffic laws.
Nice.
Perfect. Yeah, that's just an easy one for us to all think of. It's an easy way that we all fit into being citizens. We'll go down to Jackie.
First and foremost, always vote, always exercise that right. And then my husband and I try to always be involved with some sort of nonprofit community organization,
Yeah.
the hospital foundation or Boys and Girls Club, those types of things. So we're giving back.
Wonderful. And up to James.
Sure. You know, the stuff everybody's thrown out so far, you know, voting, obeying the laws. I guess you know, to add another specific one, jury duty. So, you know, those things that are not very glamorous all the time, like voting is not very glamorous all the time. Paying taxes is definitely not glamorous, but they're the things that we do as responsible citizens that help hold our community together. And while we might not like them, God likes them when we're doing it.
It's a way that God reaches down through us to serve others, which is
Yeah.
exactly what we're talking about in terms of vocation. We could throw a few more out there just to fill out the category. A lot of our listeners probably have either been in military service or know someone who has served. That would be a very valid role. We could talk about people that serve in public office, from our local government, serving as just an alderman all the way up to federal government and Congress, or as a judge, something along those lines. Those are other ways of imagining the roles of serving in the realm of the state. And so for the last one, we already said that it's work. And I think between the first conversation we all had together and this one, everybody who's listening and viewing knows what our particular jobs are. So I'm going to throw it, let's do a throwback Thursday, even though this is Friday when we're recording. And tell me about a job that you used to have when you were growing up.
Mm-hmm. I was probably my favorite job growing up was I was a clerk at a Quick Trip gas station, and had lots of opportunities to interact with my neighbors, both good and bad, behind the cash register and power washing the parking spaces and cleaning the gas pumps and stocking the coolers and all those kinds of things. That's a memorable job from my teenage years.
Julia.
I'll go.
James.
So I'll jump in. The one I think that has helped me the most in terms of just going forward in my life was got to work with one of my dad's buddies for about 6 months doing light carpentry stuff. So we built a house. We did a lot of flooring, did a lot of plumbing, did a lot of siding, stuff that I've, skills I got there that I've used a lot being a homeowner. So.
For sure.
I was a waitress and started originally as a busboy at a Greek restaurant. So when I started out bussing tables, then I worked my way up the ranks, if you will, kind of talking about that hierarchy again, into becoming a waitress and, also seating people and all that stuff. So I never did the cooking aspect of it, but, that gave me a chance to kind of like, Andrew said, interacting with a variety of people and, learned a lot of great social skills that way. So.
That's great that you guys had jobs where you got to interact with people, because one of my first jobs was working for a neighbor who owned her own retail business, and she would get freight delivered to her house on Friday, her products, and it would go into her garage, which was not heated. And I would spend a great deal of my weekend packing up her orders in a garage by myself. And it was either 100 degrees in there or it was 20 degrees in there. And I would just pack my bags of inventory and just try to keep track of how much money I was earning. And it wasn't much, my friends. Back in the day, it was about $3 an hour.
That's awesome.
Good. Well, we've all, had a variety of roles even in jobs. So we could throw in a third category from what I mentioned above. We've got some vocations that we're born with. We have some that start later in life, and then we have some that last for a season. And usually thinking about being something like a student, which is, I'd throw into, a form of job. They're always preparatory toward some sort of earning of a livelihood, amongst other things. And those first jobs count as well. We didn't have them forever, but they shaped us, they formed us, and God was still working through us to serve others. So I'll throw it back to you, Andrew, to wrap us up.
Very good. Thank you, everybody, for your input as we talk about the various ways that we live out our vocations in our lives, the estates, the realms, the spheres, all words that we use for that. And as we go forward, as we begin to resume some of our roles, may we remember that these things that we're doing, these vocations that we have, are callings from God, ways that we can show God's love to our neighbors as we interact in relationship with them. And so thank you to our panel for your sharing today, for your conversation, and for your input. And thank you to those of you who are watching as well. May you be blessed by our conversation, and may we be blessed by your interaction with it. So until another time, that's it for us, and may your day be blessed.